The stagecoach rocked so violently over the rutted mountain road that Elsie Chandler had to press her gloved hand against the window frame to keep from being thrown into the lap of the drummer sitting across from her. And she thought, not for the first time since leaving St. Louis, that perhaps this violent shaking was simply the frontier's way of trying to knock the shame out of her before she reached Timber Creek, Colorado. It was the autumn of 1878, and the aspens along the high passes had turned the color of old gold, but Elsie barely noticed the beauty sliding past the dusty glass. Her mind was still tangled in the parlors of St. Louis, in the whispered accusations that had followed her out of that city like a pack of hounds. She had done nothing wrong. She told herself that every night since it happened, and she told herself again now, watching the pines climb the ridges outside the coach. She had done nothing but reject the advances of a married man, Mr. Cornelius Abbott, the owner of the school where she had taught for 3 years, and for that refusal he had told his wife and half the city that it was Elsie who had pursued him, Elsie who had tried to ruin his marriage, Elsie who was a scheming, fallen woman unfit to instruct children. The lie had spread faster than any truth ever could. Within a month she had lost her position, her friends had stopped calling, and her own aunt, the only family she had left after her parents' passing, had suggested it might be best if Elsie found somewhere else to live, somewhere far away, where the name Chandler did not carry the taint of scandal. So she had gone west, as so many wounded and hopeful souls did in those years, boarding a train to the end of the rails and then a stagecoach into the Rocky Mountains, toward a town she had chosen almost at random from a newspaper advertisement seeking a seamstress. Timber Creek, the advertisement had said, a growing settlement in the shadow of the Rockies, home to loggers and miners and their families, in need of a woman skilled with a needle. Elsie had packed her sewing basket, her mother's silver thimble, 2 trunks of dresses and fabric, and the ashes of her old life, and she had left without looking back. The coach lurched again as it rounded a bend, and through the window Elsie caught her first sight of Timber Creek, nestled in a valley between 2 great shoulders of granite, its main street lined with false-fronted buildings of raw pine lumber, a church with a modest steeple at one end, and a saloon with a crooked sign at the other. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys. It was smaller than she had imagined, rougher, and something in her chest tightened with both fear and a strange, unfamiliar hope. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the log-built way station, and the driver called down that they had arrived, that Timber Creek was the end of this particular line, and those continuing on to the mining camps beyond would need to hire horses. Elsie gathered her skirts, accepted the drummer's hand down from the coach with a polite nod, and stepped onto the packed dirt of the street, her boots sinking slightly into the softness left by a recent rain. It was then that she saw him for the first time, though she did not yet know his name. He was unloading a wagon of furs and hides in front of the general store across the street, and Elsie found her eyes drawn to him, the way one's eyes are drawn to a mountain rising suddenly out of flat land. He stood well over 6 feet, his shoulders broad enough to strain the seams of his buckskin jacket, his forearms bare below rolled sleeves, and roped with muscle earned from years of hard labor in high country. His hair was dark and longer than city fashion allowed, tied back at the nape of his neck with a leather cord, and a short beard shadowed a strong jaw. He moved with the easy, economical strength of a man who had spent his life wrestling with the wilderness and had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. When he lifted a bundle of beaver pelts that must have weighed as much as Elsie herself, he did it as though it were no more than lifting a basket of bread. She realized she was staring, and heat rose in her cheeks, and she looked away quickly, busying herself with directing the stage driver to unload her trunks. "You'll be the new seamstress then," said a voice, and Elsie turned to find an older woman approaching from the direction of the general store, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Mrs. Hattie Winslow. I run the boarding house here in town, and I was told to expect a Miss Chandler on this coach." "Elsie Chandler," Elsie said, extending her hand, grateful for the warmth in the woman's face. "It is a pleasure, Mrs. Winslow. Thank you for arranging my room." "Come along then, dear, before that trunk of yours sinks clean into the mud." Mrs. Winslow examined her with the frank, appraising look of a woman used to sizing up strangers quickly, for her own protection and the town's. "You've come a long way." "St. Louis," the letter said, "must feel like another world out here." "It does," Elsie admitted, and there was more truth in those two words than she cared to explain. As the stage driver hefted her trunks toward Mrs. Winslow's waiting wagon, Elsie glanced once more toward the general store and found the mountain man watching her, his dark eyes steady and unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He did not smile, nor did he look away in embarrassment as she had. He simply nodded once, a small, deliberate gesture, as though acknowledging that a new soul had arrived in his valley, before he turned back to his work. Elsie did not know his name yet. She would learn it soon enough, and with it, she would learn that some men in the world judged a person not by the rumors that trailed behind them like smoke, but by the substance of what they saw with their own eyes. The boarding house sat at the far end of Timber Creek's single wide street, a two-story structure of hewn logs with a porch that looked out over the valley, and Mrs. Winslow showed Elsie to a small room on the second floor with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that framed the mountains like a painting. It was nothing like the elegant bedroom Elsie had grown up in, but it was clean, and it was hers, and no one here knew the name Cornelius Abbott or the lies he had told about her. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Winslow said from the doorway. "You'll meet the others then. There's a Mr. Prout who works the mercantile. His wife Agnes keeps to herself mostly, but she's got opinions on everything and everyone. You'll learn that quick enough. And there's Dr. Foster, our town physician, good man, a bit overworked. And of course there's Warren Walker, the mountain man you likely saw unloading pelts across the street when you stepped off the coach. He doesn't live in town proper, keeps a cabin up in the high country, but he comes down every week or two to trade his furs and game for supplies, and he takes his meals here when he's in Timber Creek. Best hunter and trapper in 3 counties, and handy in a fight or a hard winter besides. Whole town depends on him more than they'd like to admit." Elsie felt her pulse quicken slightly at the mention of his name, though she told herself it was only curiosity, the natural interest of a stranger in a stranger. "Is he from around here originally?" "No one really knows where Warren Walker is from," Mrs. Winslow said, a note of fondness creeping into her voice despite the mystery of her words. "He came into these mountains some 8 years back, built his cabin with his own 2 hands, and never spoke much of what came before. There's some say he lost people, a wife maybe, back east, and came out here to be alone with his grief. Others say he was a soldier and saw things in the war he couldn't live with in a city anymore. He doesn't talk about it, and folks around here have learned not to ask. But I'll tell you this, Miss Chandler. When the Hendricks boy went missing 3 winters back, it was Warren who found him, half frozen but alive, up on Bear Ridge. And when old Mrs. Colson's cabin caught fire 2 summers past, it was Warren who carried her out through the smoke. Whatever he ran from, he's given this town more than most who never had to run from anything at all." Elsie sat with that thought long after Mrs. Winslow had gone back downstairs, turning it over like a stone in her palm. A man with his own past to escape, his own reasons for silence. Perhaps, she thought, Timber Creek might be a town where a person's history mattered less than what they did with their hands and their heart once they arrived. She hoped so, with a desperation that surprised her. Supper that evening was a modest affair. A long table crowded with boarders and the smell of stewed venison and fresh bread, and Elsie found herself seated across from Warren Walker before she had quite composed herself for the encounter. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had appeared across the street, his presence filling the room in a way that had nothing to do with rudeness and everything to do with sheer physical solidity. He had changed from his buckskin into a clean flannel shirt for the meal, and his dark hair was still damp from washing, a few loose strands falling across his forehead in a way that softened, just slightly, the hardness of his features. "Mr. Walker, Mrs." Winslow said, ladling stew into his bowl, "This is Miss Elsie Chandler, come all the way from St. Louis to be our new seamstress." Warren's dark eyes met Elsie's across the table, and she felt the same jolt she had felt earlier, standing in the muddy street. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough as gravel underfoot, but not unkind. "Welcome to Timber Creek." "Thank you, Mr. Walker," Elsie replied, and found herself unable to look away from him for a long moment before she recalled herself and reached for her water glass. "Mrs. Winslow tells me you spend most of your time up in the mountains." "Better company up there than down here most days," he said, and though his tone was dry, there was the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile. Present company excepted, of course. A ripple of quiet laughter went around the table, and Elsie felt herself relax by a small degree, some of the tightness in her shoulders easing for the first time since she had boarded the train out of St. Louis. Across the table, a thin, sharp-eyed woman with graying hair pulled back severely from her face regarded Elsie with open curiosity. "Agnes Prout," the woman introduced herself, though not warmly. "My husband runs the mercantile. You'll be needing fabric and thread for your seamstress work, I expect. We carry a fine selection, shipped in from Denver." "I would be glad to see it, Mrs. Prout," Elsie said politely, sensing already, with the instinct of a woman who had survived one round of vicious gossip, that this was a person to be handled with care. "And what brings a young woman like yourself all the way out from St. Louis?" Agnes pressed, her eyes sharp with the particular hunger of a woman who lived for other people's business. "Seems a long way to come for seamstress work, when I'd imagine a city like that has no shortage of need for a skilled needle." Elsie felt her stomach tighten, but she had prepared for this question on the long journey west, had rehearsed the answer until it came smoothly, betraying nothing. "I wanted a change, Mrs. Prout. St. Louis had grown crowded and loud, and I had always dreamed of seeing the mountains. When I saw the advertisement for a seamstress in Timber Creek, it seemed like fate." It was not quite a lie, though it was not the whole truth either, and Elsie hoped it would be enough to satisfy the curiosity at the table. Agnes Prout studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable, her thin lips pursed, but then she seemed to accept the answer, at least for the moment, and turned her attention to her stew. Elsie glanced up to find Warren Walker watching her again, and this time there was something in his expression that made her wonder if he had seen through her careful half-truth, had recognized the shape of something being hidden behind polite words. But he said nothing, only gave her another small nod and returned to his meal, and Elsie found herself grateful, more than she could say, for a man who seemed to understand the value of not asking every question that occurred to him. Over the following days, Elsie set about establishing herself in Timber Creek. Mrs. Winslow helped her arrange a small room off the boarding house's parlor where she could take in sewing work, and word spread quickly through the small community that a new seamstress had arrived, one trained in the city, capable of fine work beyond simple mending. Within a week, Elsie had orders for 3 new dresses, a wedding suit for a rancher's son, and countless small repairs, and she found a rhythm to her days that felt, for the first time in months, something like peace. She rose early, worked through the morning at her needle by the window light, took her midday meal with the other boarders, and spent her afternoons delivering finished garments or measuring new customers, learning the names and faces of Timber Creek one by one. She learned that Dr. Foster was a widower who had lost his wife to fever the year before and threw himself into his work to avoid the silence of his own house. She learned that the town's sheriff, a broad, mustached man named Sheriff Tate, kept order with more patience than force, and that the church was led by a young reverend named Mr. Kellerman who was earnest if a bit dull in his sermons. She learned the shape of the mountains that ringed the valley, learned which peak caught the first snow each year and which held it longest, learned the sound of the creek that gave the town its name, rushing loud in the spring and quiet in the drought of late summer. And she learned, gradually, the rhythms of Warren Walker's presence in the town, for though he lived apart from it in his cabin high in the timber, he was never truly absent from its concerns. He came down every week or two with furs and game to trade at the general store, and he never failed to take his supper at Mrs. Winslow's boarding house on those nights, filling the small dining room with his quiet, solid presence. Elsie found herself, without quite admitting it to herself, looking forward to those evenings more than she should have, listening for the particular weight of his boots on the porch steps, the low rumble of his voice greeting Mrs. Winslow at the door. He was not a talkative man, but when he did speak, Elsie found herself hanging on his words in a way that unsettled her. He spoke of the mountains with a reverence she had never heard a person use for anything, describing the way the light fell through the pines at dawn, the particular silence of snow falling in the high country, the tracks of elk and bear that told him stories of the wild lives moving unseen through his valley. He spoke of these things not as a man reciting facts, but as a man in love, and Elsie began to understand that whatever pain had driven Warren Walker into these mountains 8 years before, he had found in them something that had healed him, or at least given him a place to carry his wounds without breaking further. One evening in early October, as the aspens began to lose their gold to the coming winter, Elsie was walking back from delivering a finished dress to the rancher's wife when she came upon a small commotion outside the general store. A crowd of children had gathered around something in the dust of the street, and as she drew closer, she saw it was a young boy, no older than 7, sitting in the dirt with tears streaking his dusty face and a nasty gash along his forearm, blood welling dark against his skin. He fell from the fence rail, one of the older children explained, wide-eyed, cut himself something awful on the nail. Elsie did not hesitate. She had spent enough years assisting in the schoolroom with scraped knees and split lips to know what needed doing, and there was no time to wait for Dr. Foster, who was out at a ranch attending a difficult birth, or so she had heard at supper the night before. She knelt in the dust without a thought for her skirts, tore a strip of clean linen from the petticoat beneath her dress, and pressed it firmly against the boy's wound. "There now," she said softly, gathering the frightened child against her shoulder with one arm while she held the makeshift bandage in place with the other. "You are being very brave. What is your name?" "Tommy," the boy managed between sobs. "Well, Tommy, I think you shall have quite a story to tell your friends about the scar you'll carry from this. Now hold very still for me. That's it, good boy." By the time Dr. Foster's assistant arrived a few minutes later, summoned by one of the other children, Elsie had the bleeding controlled, and the boy calmed enough that he had stopped crying entirely, listening instead with rapt attention as Elsie told him a story about a brave knight who had survived far worse wounds than his in service of a kingdom. The assistant took over the care of the wound with evident relief, and Elsie rose from the dust, brushing off her ruined skirt, to find that a small crowd of townsfolk had gathered to watch, murmuring among themselves. "That was well done, Miss Chandler," said a voice behind her, and she turned to find Warren Walker standing at the edge of the crowd, his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something warmer than his usual careful reserve. Not every woman would kneel in the street mud without a thought for her own dress. "He needed help," Elsie said simply, feeling suddenly self-conscious under the weight of so many watching eyes. It seemed a small enough thing to give. "Not so small to Tommy Hendricks, I'd wager," Warren said, and there was that faint curve at the corner of his mouth again, the one that Elsie had begun to think of as his almost smile. "Nor to his mother when she hears of it." Elsie felt heat rise in her cheeks, unrelated entirely to the exertion of the last several minutes, and she busied herself gathering her ruined petticoat scraps to avoid meeting his gaze too directly. "I only did what anyone would do, Mr. Walker." "No," he said, and something in his tone made her look up despite herself. "Not anyone, but I'm glad it was you who happened by." He touched the brim of his hat then, a small courtesy, and continued on toward the general store, leaving Elsie standing in the street with her heart beating a strange, unfamiliar rhythm, and the distinct feeling that something important had shifted between them, some quiet recognition passing from his eyes to hers that neither of them had spoken aloud. Word of the incident spread through Timber Creek quickly, as such things did in small towns, and Elsie found herself the subject of considerably warmer regard than she had experienced in her first weeks in the settlement. Mothers who had eyed her with the natural suspicion reserved for newcomers began to greet her by name in the street. The boy's own mother, a rancher's wife named Mrs. Hendricks, brought Elsie a basket of preserves as thanks, insisting she take it despite Elsie's protests that she had done nothing worth such generosity. It seemed, for a time, that Elsie Chandler was on her way to becoming simply Elsie Chandler, seamstress of Timber Creek, without the weight of St. Louis trailing behind her like a shadow. But shadows, Elsie would learn, had a way of catching up with even the swiftest traveler. The letter arrived on a gray morning in late October, carried up from the stage station by Mrs. Winslow herself, who delivered it to Elsie's sewing room with an expression Elsie did not like at all. "This came for you," Mrs. Winslow said, holding out an envelope addressed in a hand Elsie recognized immediately with a sinking feeling in her stomach. Her aunt's hand. Postmarked St. Louis. Elsie's fingers trembled slightly as she took the letter, and she waited until Mrs. Winslow had left the room, though not before noticing the woman's curious, searching glance, before she broke the seal and read. The letter was brief and cruel, though Elsie suspected her aunt had not intended cruelty so much as a kind of exhausted honesty. Mr. Abbott's wife, having discovered the true nature of her husband's dishonesty through some confession or confrontation Elsie's aunt did not detail, had grown so consumed with bitterness that she had taken to writing letters of warning to any place she believed Elsie might have fled, describing Elsie as a scheming seductress, who had nearly destroyed a respectable marriage and ought not to be trusted near any decent household or, worse, any children. Elsie's aunt warned that such a letter might well have already been sent to Timber Creek, for the woman had grown fixated in her fury and seemed determined to follow Elsie's reputation across the entire country if necessary. Elsie sat very still for a long moment after reading, the letter loose in her lap, feeling the small, fragile piece she had built over the past weeks crack straight through the middle like ice on a spring pond. She did not have long to wonder whether the warning had come too late. 3 days after the letter arrived, Elsie walked into the general store to purchase thread and found the atmosphere subtly, unmistakably changed. Agnes Prout, who had grown almost friendly in recent weeks, greeted her with a coolness that bordered on contempt, and 2 women Elsie had come to know as pleasant customers turned their backs slightly as she passed, murmuring to each other in tones too low to catch but unmistakable in their intent. "Mrs. Prout," Elsie said carefully, approaching the counter, "I only need 3 spools of the blue thread if you have it." Agnes did not move to retrieve the thread immediately. Instead, she studied Elsie with an expression of cold triumph, the look of a woman who believed she had finally uncovered the truth she had suspected all along. "I received an interesting letter this week, Miss Chandler, from a woman in St. Louis, a Mrs. Cornelius Abbott." Elsie felt the blood drain from her face, but she forced herself to remain standing straight, to meet Agnes Prout's eyes without flinching, though her heart was hammering so hard she feared it might be audible across the counter. "I do not know what such a letter might have said, Mrs. Prout, but I can assure you—" "She says you seduced her husband," Agnes cut in, her voice rising enough that several other customers in the store turned to listen, "that you used your position as a teacher to corrupt a respectable man, and that you were run out of the city in disgrace when the truth came to light. She warns any decent town to be wary of taking you in." The store had gone very quiet. Elsie felt every eye turned toward her, felt the weight of judgment settling over her shoulders like a physical thing, familiar and crushing. the same weight she had fled 2,000 miles to escape. "That is not what happened," Elsie said, and her voice came out steadier than she had expected, though it trembled at the edges. "Mr. Abbott pursued me, against my wishes, repeatedly, and when I refused him and threatened to report his conduct to the school board, he told his wife and anyone who would listen a story that would protect his own reputation at the cost of mine. I lost my position. I lost my friends. I did nothing, Mrs. Prout, but refuse a married man's advances, and I have paid for that refusal with my good name ever since." It was the truth, spoken plainly for the first time since she had arrived in Timber Creek, and yet she could see immediately that it made little difference to the faces watching her. A story of scandal, once planted, grew roots faster than any denial could dig them out. Agnes Prout's expression did not soften. If anything, it hardened further, certain now that she had caught Elsie in exactly the kind of self-serving denial a guilty woman would offer. "Well," Agnes said primly, folding her hands atop the counter, "I think it would be best, Miss Chandler, if you took your business elsewhere from now on. I've a respectable establishment to think of, and my husband's good name besides." Elsie left the store without her thread, her cheeks burning, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall until she had reached the privacy of her room at the boarding house. There, finally, she allowed herself to weep, curled on the narrow bed with her mother's silver thimble clutched in her fist, wondering if there was anywhere in this vast country wide enough to outrun a lie determined enough to follow. The days that followed were among the loneliest Elsie had known. Word of the letter spread through Timber Creek with the same speed her earlier kindness had, and though not everyone turned from her entirely, the warmth she had begun to feel from the town cooled considerably. Orders for sewing work slowed to a trickle. Women who had greeted her cheerfully in the street now offered only tight, uncomfortable nods before hurrying on their way. Even Mrs. Hendricks, whose son Elsie had helped, seemed torn between gratitude and the pressure of her neighbor's suspicion, and her visits to the boarding house ceased. Only Mrs. Winslow seemed unmoved by the gossip, continuing to treat Elsie with the same brisk kindness she had shown from the first day, though even she grew quiet on the subject, as though unwilling to discuss what she did not fully understand. And there was Warren Walker. He came down from the mountains as usual that week, his wagon loaded with furs, and Elsie, dreading his reaction more than anyone else's, for reasons she did not allow herself to examine too closely, avoided the dining room that evening, taking a small plate of bread and cheese to eat alone in her sewing room instead. But she had not been sitting there long, staring blankly at a half-finished hem, when a knock sounded at her door. "Miss Chandler," Warren's voice, low and even, carried through the wood. "Might I have a word?" Elsie's heart clenched with something that felt uncomfortably close to dread. She had expected by now that even Warren Walker's good opinion of her must have curdled along with the rest of the town's. She rose slowly, smoothed her skirts with hands that trembled, and opened the door. He stood in the narrow hallway, his hat in his hands, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "I heard what happened at the Mercantile," he said without preamble. "Agnes Prout has been telling anyone who will listen." "I imagine she has," Elsie said, and could not quite keep the bitterness from her voice. "I suppose you have come to hear my side of it, though I doubt it will change much of anything now." Something flickered across Warren's face, something that looked almost like hurt. "I came," he said slowly, "because I wanted you to know that I don't believe a word of what that woman's letter said, and I never will, no matter what's written on a piece of paper mailed from 2,000 miles away." Elsie stared at him, unable for a moment to trust that she had heard him correctly. "You do not even know the truth of what happened, Mr. Walker. How can you be so certain?" "I've known you 6 weeks," Warren said, stepping closer, close enough that Elsie had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. "I've watched you kneel in the street mud to bandage a boy's arm without a thought for your own dress. I've watched you work your fingers raw sewing dresses for women who barely thank you for it. I've listened to you talk about the mountains like you're already half in love with them, same as me. A woman who did the things that letter claims doesn't spend her days doing the things I've watched you do, Miss Chandler. I don't need to know every detail of what happened in St. Louis to know the shape of your character now, in front of me, with my own eyes. And that's the only evidence I trust. Elsie felt tears rising again, though these were different from the bitter, frightened tears of the past days. Why does it matter to you what I did or did not do, Mr. Walker? Warren was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as though he were weighing words carefully before he spoke them. Because 8 years ago, he said finally, I came into these mountains carrying my own kind of shame, Miss Chandler, though for different reasons than yours. I was a soldier in the war, and I did things and saw things and lost people that I couldn't speak of to another living soul when it was over. When I came home to Ohio, folks looked at me like I was something broken, something to be handled carefully or avoided altogether, and I couldn't stand the weight of it, so I ran, same as you did, just in a different direction and for a different sin. I know what it is to carry something heavy that other people put on your back without ever asking if you wanted to carry it. I'll not add my own weight to yours. Not now. Not ever. The confession hung in the narrow hallway between them, more vulnerable than anything Elsie had yet heard from this quiet, careful man, and she found herself reaching out, almost without meaning to touch his forearm where it emerged from his rolled sleeve, the muscle beneath her fingers taut as a drawn bow. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me, Warren." It was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw something shift in his eyes at the sound of it, something warm and startled and pleased all at once. "You're welcome, Elsie," he said, and the sound of her own name in his low, rough voice sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold October evening. "Now, I mean to see to it that this town remembers who you are by what you do, not by what some spiteful woman wrote from a place none of us will ever see. Will you let me help with that?" "I do not see how you could," Elsie said, though hope had begun treacherously to bloom in her chest. "Leave that to me," Warren said, and there was something almost fierce in the set of his jaw as he said it, the look of a man who had decided on a course of action and would not be easily turned from it. "Just keep doing what you've been doing all along, Elsie. Keep being exactly who you are. I'll handle the rest." He left her standing in the doorway of her sewing room, her heart pounding, her mind spinning with the confession he had made and the promise he had left hanging in the air like the scent of pine after rain. And for the first time since Agnes Prutt's cruel revelation in the Mercantile, Elsie allowed herself to believe that perhaps she was not entirely alone in this valley after all. True to his word, Warren Walker set about his quiet campaign in the days that followed, though he did it in a manner so unassuming that Elsie only pieced together the full extent of his efforts much later. He spoke to Sheriff Tate over cards one evening, reminding the man, apparently, of exactly how many hours Elsie had spent nursing Tommy Hendricks's wound before the doctor's assistant had even arrived, and how the boy might have lost far more blood without her quick action. He mentioned, in passing conversation at the general store, that he had heard Elsie was taking in mending for free from families who could not afford her usual rates, a fact Elsie had not told anyone, having done it quietly out of simple decency rather than any desire for recognition. He spoke with the Reverend Kellerman about Christian charity and the danger of judging a soul on second-hand rumor rather than first-hand character, a conversation that apparently found its way, in modified form, into the following Sunday's sermon. And when Agnes Prutt attempted to continue her campaign of cold shoulders and pointed whispers at a church social held in the first week of November, Warren Walker did something that would be spoken of in Timber Creek for years afterward. The social was held in the small church hall, tables laden with pies and preserves brought by the women of the town, and Elsie had come reluctantly, at Mrs. Winslow's insistence that hiding away would only feed the gossip further. She stood near the edge of the room, uncomfortably aware of the space that had opened around her, the way conversation seemed to pause and resume at a slightly lower volume whenever she drew near, when Warren Walker crossed the hall directly to her side, in full view of everyone present, and offered her his arm. "Miss Chandler," he said, loud enough to carry, "would you do me the honor of sharing a plate with me? I hear Mrs. Winslow's apple pie is not to be missed, and I could use some good company to enjoy it with." The hall had gone quiet, dozens of eyes turning toward them, and Elsie felt her cheeks flush scarlet, torn between mortification at the sudden attention and a fierce, grateful warmth at the sight of this enormous, powerful man standing beside her without a trace of hesitation, as though daring anyone in the room to voice an objection. "I would be glad to, Mr. Walker," Elsie managed, taking his offered arm, and together they crossed the hall to the dessert table, Warren's presence at her side seeming to part the murmuring crowd like a ship parting water. It was Agnes Prout who finally broke the tense silence, unable, it seemed, to help herself. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice carrying its familiar note of righteous certainty, "surely you have heard the letter I received regarding Miss Chandler's conduct back in St. Louis. I would think a man of your standing in this community would wish to be more careful of the company he keeps." Warren turned to face her fully, and though his voice remained even and calm, there was steel beneath it that made several nearby conversations stop entirely. "I have heard your letter, Mrs. Prout, second-hand from half the town, though I notice you've never once shown a single soul the actual paper it was written on. I have also watched, with my own eyes, Miss Chandler kneel in the mud of the street to save a bleeding child, mend clothes for free for families who couldn't pay her, and conduct herself with more grace under unkind scrutiny than I've seen from most folks who claim to be pillars of decency in this town. I'd rather trust what I've witnessed myself than a letter written by a bitter woman 2,000 miles away, describing a version of events none of us were present for. If you'd care to write to St. Louis and ask for the schoolmaster's side, and Elsie's, before you condemn a person on one angry wife's word alone, I'd think that the more Christian approach, wouldn't you, given where we're standing tonight?" The words landed in the church hall like stones dropped in still water, rippling outward in a silence that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Agnes Prout's mouth opened and closed once, twice, finding no ready response to a challenge so directly and calmly delivered in front of the entire congregation. Reverend Kellerman, standing near the punch bowl, cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker raises a fair point," the Reverend said carefully. "We are none of us so free of sin ourselves that we ought to be quick to cast judgment on second-hand tales, however they come to us. Miss Chandler has conducted herself with nothing but kindness since her arrival in Timber Creek, and I think that ought to weigh heavier in our hearts than any letter from a stranger. It was not a complete victory, not immediately." Agnes Prout retreated to a corner of the hall with two of her closest confidants, her expression thunderous, and Elsie knew there would remain some in Timber Creek who would never fully release their suspicion, no matter what evidence stood before them. But something had shifted that evening. Some tide had turned, and Elsie felt it in the way several of the women near the dessert table began, hesitantly at first, to include her in their conversation about the coming winter's preparations, in the way old Mrs. Colson, whom Warren had once carried from a burning cabin, patted Elsie's hand and told her not to mind Agnes Prout, who had never had a kind word for anyone in 30 years of living in Timber Creek. Elsie glanced up at Warren beside her, and found him watching her with an expression of such open warmth that her breath caught in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered, for what felt like the 100th time that month, though she meant it no less for the repetition. "You don't need to keep thanking me, Elsie," Warren said quietly, for her ears alone. "I'd do a great deal more than speak up at a church social if it meant seeing you smile the way you're smiling right now." Elsie felt her cheeks warm again, though this time for an entirely different reason than embarrassment, and she found herself hoping, with a fierceness that surprised her, that this quiet, strong man might mean to stay close to her for a long while yet. Winter came early and hard to Timber Creek that year, as it often did in the high country of Colorado, and by the first week of December, the valley lay buried beneath 2 feet of snow, with the peaks above wearing even deeper drifts. It was in the midst of this deepening winter that Elsie's standing in the town, already improving since the church social, was cemented beyond any further question, though it came at the cost of a night of terror that Elsie would remember for the rest of her life. A sudden blizzard blew in from the northwest on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December, the sky turning from pale winter blue to a churning, angry gray within the span of an hour, snow driving sideways on winds that howled down from the peaks like something alive and furious. It caught half the town unprepared, including, most dangerously, 6 children who had been let out from the small schoolhouse just before the storm's onset, and had not yet made it home when the full fury of the blizzard descended. Elsie learned of the crisis when Mrs. Winslow burst into the boarding-house parlor, her face white with fear, explaining that her own granddaughter, 7-year-old Mary, was among the missing children along with 5 others, and that a search party was forming at the church, though visibility had already dropped to less than an arm's length in the swirling snow. "Warren," Mrs. Winslow gasped. "He's already gone out, he and Sheriff Tate and a few others, but I fear—" She could not finish the sentence, her hands twisting in her apron. Elsie did not think. She simply acted, throwing on her heaviest coat, wrapping a wool scarf tight around her face and following Mrs. Winslow out into the howling white chaos of the street, where a small cluster of frightened parents and townsfolk had gathered near the church, shouting instructions to each other that the wind tore away before they could be fully heard. The children were last seen heading toward the schoolhouse road, Sheriff Tate was shouting, his voice barely audible over the storm, but in this wind they could have wandered anywhere. Warren's headed toward the creek, thinks they might have tried to follow the water back toward town, since it's the one landmark they'd know in a whiteout. Elsie did not wait for permission or instruction. She had spent enough of her childhood exploring the woods near her grandfather's farm in Missouri to have some instinct for how frightened, lost children might behave, and something told her, with a certainty she could not fully explain, that young children caught in a sudden storm would not think to follow a creek they could no longer see through blinding snow, but would instead seek the nearest shelter they could find, however small. "The old grain shed," she said suddenly, grabbing Mrs. Winslow's sleeve. "Along the schoolhouse road, there's that abandoned grain shed the Colsons used to use. If the children got frightened and confused, wouldn't they look for the first shelter they could find rather than try to navigate all the way home?" Mrs. Winslow's eyes widened. "Mary knows that shed, she's played there before. Oh, Elsie, you might be right." Elsie did not wait to see if anyone else believed her theory. She simply turned and began walking into the storm, in the direction of the schoolhouse road, her boots sinking deep with each step, the wind screaming in her ears and driving snow like needles against every exposed inch of skin. She called out as she walked, Mary's name and the names of the other missing children, her voice swallowed almost instantly by the storm's roar. But she pressed on regardless, following the general direction of the road as best she could judge it beneath the featureless white blanket that had erased every familiar landmark. She had gone perhaps a quarter mile, her fingers growing numb despite her gloves, her lungs burning with the effort of breathing in air so cold it felt solid, when a massive shape loomed suddenly out of the whiteness ahead of her, and she nearly cried out in fright before she recognized the broad shoulders and dark, snow-crusted hair of Warren Walker. "Elsie." His voice, even shouting against the wind, carried a note of alarm that cut through the cold like a blade. "What in God's name are you doing out here alone? You could freeze to death, or lose your way entirely." "The grain shed," Elsie shouted back, fighting to be heard. "The old Colson grain shed along this road. Mary knows it, plays there. I thought the children might have gone there for shelter rather than try to find their way home." Something in Warren's expression shifted immediately from alarm to sharp focus. "Show me," he said, and together they pressed forward into the storm, Warren's massive hand closing around Elsie's smaller one to keep her from stumbling in the near blindness of the driving snow. His body angled slightly to break the worst of the wind's force before it struck her. They found the shed perhaps 10 minutes later, a low, weathered structure that Elsie would have walked straight past in the whiteout had she not known precisely what she was searching for. And when Warren threw open the sagging door, they found, huddled together in the far corner atop a pile of old, moldering hay, all 6 missing children, cold and frightened but alive, Mary Winslow's arms wrapped protectively around the smallest of the group, a boy no older than 5. "We got scared," Mary said, her small voice trembling, tears freezing on her cheeks, "and we couldn't see the way home, so we came here because I remembered it from playing in summer. But then it just kept snowing and we didn't know what to do." "You did exactly right, sweetheart," Warren said. His rough voice softened into something gentle Elsie had not heard from him before, as he swept the smallest boy up into his powerful arms, wrapping him inside his own heavy coat for warmth. "You found shelter and you stayed together, which is the smartest thing you could have done. Now we're going to get you all home safe and warm." It took the better part of an hour to guide all 6 children back through the storm to the church, where frantic parents wept with relief at the sight of them, and Elsie found herself, once the children were safely delivered into waiting arms and warm blankets, suddenly overwhelmed by the release of tension, her knees weak, her whole body trembling from cold and exhaustion and the fading rush of fear. "Elsie." Warren's hands were suddenly on her shoulders, steadying her, his dark eyes searching her face with open concern. "You're frozen through. Come, sit by the fire before you catch your own chill from this." He guided her to a bench near the church's iron stove, wrapping his own coat, still warm from his body despite the storm, around her shoulders in addition to her own, and Elsie found herself laughing suddenly, a slightly hysterical, relieved sound, as the warmth began to seep back into her frozen limbs. "We found them," she said, as though she could hardly believe it herself. "I was so afraid, Warren, that I was wrong, that we would search all night and never find any trace of them." "You weren't wrong," Warren said, kneeling before her, his large hands wrapping around her small, cold ones to warm them between his palms. "You saved those children's lives tonight, Elsie Chandler. Every bit as much as anyone else in that search party. More, maybe, since it was your idea that led us straight to them." Word of Elsie's role in the rescue spread through Timber Creek even faster than Agnes Pruitt's cruel letter had spread weeks before, and this time there was no ambiguity in how the town received the news. Mary Winslow's parents wept openly with gratitude when they learned of Elsie's part in finding their daughter. The parents of the other 5 children came, one by one, over the following days, to the boarding house to offer their thanks, some bringing gifts, others simply words of profound relief and appreciation. Even Agnes Pruitt, when Elsie next entered the mercantile to purchase thread, found herself unable to maintain her earlier coldness, though she managed only a stiff, grudging acknowledgement. "I understand you played some part in finding the schoolchildren during the storm, Miss Chandler," she said, not quite meeting Elsie's eyes. "That was a credit to you." It was not warmth, not exactly, but it was something, a crack in the wall of suspicion that had been building since the letter's arrival, and Elsie accepted it graciously, understanding that some hearts once closed opened only slowly, one careful degree at a time. But the true turning point, the moment Elsie would look back on for the rest of her life as the night the town of Timber Creek finally chose to remember her by her deeds rather than by a stranger's cruel words, came the following Sunday, when Reverend Kellerman stood before his congregation and spoke, without needing to name her directly, of a woman who had come to their town as a stranger, who had been judged unfairly by rumor and gossip, and who had, in the face of that unjust judgment, continued to act with nothing but courage and kindness, culminating in her role in saving 6 children's lives during the worst blizzard the valley had seen in a decade. "We are commanded," the Reverend said, his voice carrying clearly through the small church, to judge a tree by its fruit, and not by the whispers that grow up around its roots. I think we have all seen now, plain as day, what fruit grows from Miss Elsie Chandler's character, and I think it is past time this congregation offered her the welcome she has more than earned. The congregation, as one, turned toward where Elsie sat near the back of the church, and to her overwhelming surprise, broke into applause, a warm, sustained sound that filled the small wooden building and brought tears to Elsie's eyes faster than any cruelty ever had. Beside her, Warren Walker reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently, his dark eyes bright with something that looked remarkably like pride. "Welcome home, Elsie," he murmured, low enough for only her to hear, and Elsie felt, for the first time since she had boarded that train out of St. Louis so many months before, that she had finally truly found a place where she belonged. The weeks that followed the blizzard rescue brought a change to Elsie's life in Timber Creek that felt almost like waking from a long, uneasy dream into brighter daylight. Orders for sewing work returned in greater number than before, women who had once avoided her now stopping by her sewing room simply to talk, to share the small news and troubles of daily life, as though Elsie had always been one of their own. The children she had helped rescue took to greeting her in the street with the particular fierce loyalty of the young, running up to hug her skirts whenever they saw her, and their parents' gratitude showed itself in 100 small kindnesses, baskets of preserves and fresh bread left at the boarding house door, an invitation to Christmas dinner at the Winslow family's table. And through all of it, Warren Walker remained a steady, warming presence at her side, though it took the particular slowness of a careful man's courtship for what had grown between them to be spoken aloud. It was on a clear, cold evening in late January, the sky above Timber Creek scattered thick with stars in the way only high mountain air allowed, that Warren finally found the words he had apparently been gathering for weeks. He had walked Elsie back from a quilting circle at Mrs. Hendricks's ranch, the two of them moving slowly along the snow-packed road beneath a sky so brilliant with starlight that Elsie had stopped twice simply to look up at it in wonder. And it was during the second such pause, standing close together in the cold, silent night, that Warren spoke. "Elsie," he said, his voice carrying an uncertainty she had rarely heard from him, this man who moved through the wilderness with such unshakable confidence. "I've been trying to find the right words for weeks now, and I don't seem to be any closer to finding them, so I suppose I'll just have to say what's plain and true and hope it's enough." Elsie turned to face him, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, her heart suddenly pounding with an anticipation she had not allowed herself to fully acknowledge until this moment. "What is it, Warren? I came into these mountains 8 years ago believing I'd never again find a reason to want anything more than the quiet and the solitude they offered me," Warren said, his dark eyes steady on hers despite the vulnerability in his voice. "I told myself I was content, that a man who'd seen what I'd seen and done what I'd done in the war had no business seeking out more than that. And I believed it, right up until the day I watched a woman I barely knew step down off a stagecoach into a muddy street, and something in me that I thought had gone permanently quiet sat up and took notice for the first time in years." "Warren," Elsie whispered, her heart so full she could barely find her own voice. "I love you, Elsie Chandler," he continued, the words coming easier now that the first had been spoken, like water breaking through a long-frozen dam. "I love your courage and your kindness, and the way you refuse to let this town's cruelty break you, even when it would have been easier to run again rather than fight to prove them wrong. I love the way you talk to children like their fears matter, and the way you never once let a hard winter or a harder rumor dim the light in your eyes. I don't have much to offer you, Elsie, not the kind of fine things a city gentleman might, but I have a cabin that's warm through the worst winters this valley can throw at it, and I have 2 strong arms that would spend every day of the rest of my life working to keep you safe and cared for, if you would have me." Elsie felt tears freezing at the corners of her eyes even as warmth spread through her entire chest, and she did not hesitate before answering, certain in a way she had not been certain of anything since the day her old life had crumbled beneath her. "I love you too, Warren Walker. I have, I think, since the very first evening you sat across from me at Mrs. Winslow's table and told me you preferred the company of the mountains, except for present company excepted, and made me feel, for the first time in months, that perhaps I was worth accepting." Warren's face broke into a full smile then, the first true, unguarded smile Elsie had ever seen from him, transforming his rugged features into something almost boyish in its joy, and he reached up with one large, calloused hand to cup her cold cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Then will you marry me, Elsie? Will you come live with me in my cabin up in the timber, and let me spend the rest of my days making certain this valley remembers you exactly the way you deserve to be remembered, as the kindest, bravest woman ever to grace its streets?" "Yes," Elsie said, laughing through her tears, the word coming out on a breath of joy that clouded white in the frigid mountain air between them. "Yes, Warren, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then, beneath that vast, star-scattered sky, his lips warm against hers despite the biting cold of the January night, his strong arms wrapping around her with a gentleness that belied the raw power Elsie could feel in every line of his powerful frame. And Elsie felt, in that moment, that every mile of her long, painful journey west had led, with unerring purpose, directly to this. To this man, this valley, this unexpected, hard-won love that had grown from the ashes of a scandal she had once believed would follow her forever. They were married in the small Timber Creek church on the first Saturday in March, as the last deep snows of winter began their slow retreat from the valley floor, though the peaks above still wore their white crowns and would for months yet to come. The church, which had once held a congregation uncertain of Elsie's worth, now overflowed with well-wishers, every pew filled with the families whose children she had helped, whose sicknesses she had nursed, whose lives she had touched in the months since her arrival. Mrs. Winslow wept openly through the entire ceremony, having come to think of Elsie as something like a daughter in the months of her boarding. Even Agnes Prude attended, and though her congratulations remained somewhat stiff, she had, in a gesture that surprised the entire town, gifted the couple a length of fine blue silk from the mercantile's finest stock, a small but unmistakable olive branch. Elsie wore a dress of pale ivory silk that she had sewn with her own hands over the preceding weeks, working late into the evenings by candlelight, adding small embroidered mountain wildflowers along the hem in a private tribute to the valley that had become her home. Warren stood at the altar in a suit that Elsie suspected he had not worn since some long-ago life before the war, his dark hair combed back neatly for the occasion, though nothing could quite tame the powerful, wild strength that seemed to radiate from him even in his finest clothes. When Elsie walked down the narrow aisle toward him, escorted by Sheriff Tate in the absence of any family of her own able to make the journey west, she saw tears standing openly in Warren's dark eyes, and she thought she had never seen anything more beautiful in her life than the sight of this strong, quiet mountain man undone by love in front of the entire town that had once doubted her. "I, Warren Walker, take you Elsie Chandler," he said, his rough voice thick with emotion as Reverend Kellerman led them through their vows, "to have and to hold in the hardest winters and the brightest summers, to protect you with every strength I possess, and to love you until the last breath leaves my body, so long as we both shall live." "I, Elsie Chandler, take you, Warren Walker," Elsie replied, her own voice trembling with happiness, "to have and to hold, to build a home and a life together in this valley that has become dearer to me than any place I have ever known, and to love you fully and without reservation, for as long as I am given breath to do so." When Reverend Kellerman pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted into applause and cheering that Elsie suspected could be heard clear across the valley, and Warren swept her into a kiss that drew a chorus of good-natured hollering from the assembled crowd, his powerful arms lifting her briefly off her feet in his enthusiasm, as though he could not contain the joy that filled him. They celebrated late into the evening at a reception held in the church hall, tables groaning under the weight of dishes brought by nearly every family in town, and Elsie danced until her feet ached, first with Warren, whose surprising grace on the dance floor belied his massive frame, and then with Sheriff Tate and Dr. Foster, and even briefly and awkwardly with a blushing Reverend Kellerman, who admitted he had not danced since his own seminary days. It was well past midnight when Warren finally led Elsie out to the wagon that would carry them up into the mountains, toward the cabin that would now be her home, and as they rode beneath a sky once again brilliant with stars, Elsie leaned her head against her husband's broad shoulder and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely at peace. The cabin, when they arrived, proved to be everything Warren had promised and more. A sturdy structure of hewn logs with a great stone fireplace that Warren had built himself over the course of that first year in the mountains, a loft bedroom warmed by rising heat, and windows that looked out over a small clearing where deer often came to graze in the early morning light. Warren had spent weeks, Elsie learned in the following days, preparing the cabin for her arrival, adding a second chair by the fire, clearing space for her sewing basket near the best window light, even building a small addition off the main room that he intended. He admitted with a trace of shyness, she found utterly endearing in so powerful a man, as a nursery, should they be blessed with children in the years to come. Their first months of marriage passed in a haze of contentment that Elsie had not known was possible for her to feel, after the pain and uncertainty of the preceding year. She learned to keep a mountain household through the tail end of a Colorado winter, learned to bank a fire properly to last through the longest, coldest nights, learned the particular satisfaction of watching her husband return from a day's trapping with game enough to see them comfortably through the week. Warren, in turn, learned the particular joy of coming home each evening to a warm cabin and a warmer welcome, of watching his wife's needle catch the firelight as she worked on some new garment in the evenings, of falling asleep each night with her tucked securely against his chest, his arms wrapped around her as though he could not quite believe, even after weeks of marriage, that such happiness had truly come to find him in these mountains he had once sought out only for solitude. Spring came to the valley in a great, sudden rush of green, the aspens leafing out almost overnight, wildflowers carpeting the meadows below the cabin in colors so vivid Elsie found herself sketching them in the margins of her sewing patterns, unable to resist capturing their beauty. Elsie continued her sewing work, though now she traveled down into Timber Creek only twice a week rather than living there full time, and the town, far from having forgotten her in her absence, welcomed her each visit with a warmth that still occasionally brought unexpected tears to her eyes, remembering how differently that same town had once regarded her. It was in early summer, as the wildflowers gave way to the tall grasses of July, that Elsie began to suspect she was carrying a child, and when Dr. Foster confirmed the news on one of her trips into town, she found herself hurrying home to the cabin with an urgency that left her breathless by the time she reached the door, eager to share the news with Warren before he had even finished unsaddling his horse. "Warren," she called out, and something in her voice must have carried enough excitement that he turned immediately, concern and curiosity warring on his rugged features. "Warren, I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." For a long moment, Warren simply stared at her, as though the words had not quite reached him yet, and then his face broke into that full, unguarded smile that Elsie had come to treasure above almost anything else in the world, and he crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, sweeping her up into his powerful arms with a whoop of joy that echoed off the surrounding peaks. "A baby," he repeated, setting her down gently, his large hands coming to rest with sudden, reverent care against her still flat stomach, as though he could somehow feel the new life growing there through touch alone. "Elsie, we're going to have a baby." He spent the following months finishing the nursery edition with a care and attention that Elsie found deeply moving, crafting a small wooden cradle by hand during the long evening hours, sanding every surface until it was smooth as silk, carving small mountain wildflowers into the headboard in a quiet echo of the ones Elsie had embroidered on her wedding dress. He grew, if anything, more protective of her as her pregnancy progressed, insisting on carrying every bucket of water himself despite Elsie's protests that she was perfectly capable, watching her navigate the cabin's single step with an anxiety that Elsie found equal parts exasperating and endearing. Their son was born on a bright morning in early April of the following year, 1879, nearly a full year after their wedding, delivered with the assistance of Dr. Foster and a local midwife, who had traveled up from Timber Creek at the first signs of labor. Warren, banished to the main room during the birth itself despite his protests, paced the floorboards for hours with an anxiety that Elsie later learned had worn a visible track into the wood, and when he was finally permitted back into the room to see his wife and newborn son, tears streamed openly and unashamedly down his weathered face. "He's beautiful," Warren whispered, kneeling beside the bed to gently touch the tiny hand of his son, who gripped his father's enormous finger with a strength that made Warren laugh through his tears. "Elsie, he's perfect." "What shall we name him?" Elsie asked, exhausted but glowing with a happiness so profound it seemed to fill the entire cabin. "I thought," Warren said slowly, "if you agreed, we might call him after your father if you'd like that. You've told me so many stories of his kindness, and I'd be honored to see his name carried on in our son." Elsie's eyes filled with grateful tears at the thoughtfulness of the suggestion, and so their son was christened Charles Warren Walker, in honor of both the father Elsie had lost and the father he would grow up knowing. And the town of Timber Creek, when Elsie and Warren brought the infant down for his christening at the church 3 weeks later, welcomed him with the same warmth and generosity they had eventually shown his mother, gifts and well wishes pouring in from every family in the valley. 2 more children followed in the years after Charles. A daughter named Grace, born in 1881 with her mother's gentle spirit and her father's fierce protectiveness even from her earliest years, and a second son, William, born in 1884, who grew from infancy to show an unmistakable love of the mountains that mirrored his father's own, following Warren on shorter and shorter versions of his trapping routes almost as soon as he could reliably walk the distance. Elsie's seamstress business grew steadily through those years, eventually expanding enough that she took on a young apprentice, a girl named Susanna who had arrived in Timber Creek under her own difficult circumstances, having lost both parents to fever within the same terrible month. And Elsie found a particular satisfaction in teaching the girl not only the skills of her trade, but the same lesson she herself had learned so painfully upon her own arrival in this valley: that a person's worth was measured not by the misfortunes that befell them, nor by the cruel words others might speak about them, but by the character they showed in how they chose to face those misfortunes. Warren, for his part, remained the valley's most trusted hunter and guide for many years, though as his children grew, he began spending more of his time closer to home, teaching Charles and William the skills of tracking and trapping that he had spent a lifetime perfecting, while Grace, who showed from an early age an aptitude for her mother's needlework, spent many contented afternoons in Elsie's sewing room, learning to thread a needle almost before she had learned her letters. The town of Timber Creek itself grew steadily through those years as well, the mining and logging trade bringing new families into the valley each season, and Elsie found, as the years passed, that the story of the scandal that had once threatened to define her had faded almost entirely from the town's collective memory, replaced instead by the story townsfolk told newcomers of the brave young seamstress who had helped find 6 lost children during the Great Blizzard of 1878. who had nursed the sick and mended clothes for those who could not pay, and who had married the valley's own legendary mountain man in a wedding still remembered as one of the finest Timber Creek had ever seen. Agnes Prout, in one of the more unexpected developments of those years, became, if not quite a close friend to Elsie, at least a genuine ally, the two women finding common ground eventually in their shared love of fine fabric and their mutual, fierce devotion to the town's children. And when Agnes's own granddaughter was born some years later, it was Elsie who sewed the christening gown, a gesture that both women understood without needing to speak of it directly. As a kind of quiet reconciliation for the pain of that first difficult autumn. On a warm summer evening in 1888, 10 years after Elsie Chandler had first stepped off a dusty stagecoach into the muddy streets of Timber Creek, carrying nothing but 2 trunks and the weight of an unjust scandal, she stood on the porch of the cabin she now considered more truly home than any place she had ever known, watching her 3 children play in the meadow below, while fireflies began to rise from the tall summer grass like scattered stars come down to earth. Warren came to stand beside her as he had every evening for the past decade, his powerful arms settling around her waist, and together they watched Charles, now 9 years old and already showing his father's easy strength, teaching his younger siblings some game of his own invention, their laughter carrying up through the warm evening air. "Do you ever think about it?" Warren asked quietly after a long, contented silence. "That day you stepped off the stage, not knowing a single soul in this valley, carrying all that pain from St. Louis with you." "Sometimes," Elsie admitted, leaning into the solid warmth of her husband's side. "But it feels like a story about someone else now, someone I knew once but am not entirely anymore. I think that frightened young woman would hardly recognize the life I have built here, Warren. She could never have imagined it." "I think," Warren said, pressing a gentle kiss to the crown of her head, "that she was braver than she knew to keep walking forward even when the whole world seemed determined to knock her down. And I think this valley is a far better place for having had the good fortune to receive her, whatever ugly rumors tried to follow behind." Elsie turned in his arms to look up at this man who had stood beside her through every trial the past decade had offered, who had defended her good name before an entire church congregation, who had built her a home with his own powerful hands, and filled it with 3 beautiful children and a love so steady and true that she sometimes still marveled, after all these years, at her own good fortune in finding it. "I love you, Warren Walker," she said, the words as true and unshakable now as they had been on that starlit January night when he had first spoken them to her. "More than I think I ever fully understood love could be before you." "And I love you, Elsie Walker," Warren replied, using her married name with the same quiet reverence he always did, as though it were the finest title he could imagine bestowing upon her. "Now and for every day left to us in this life, however many the good Lord chooses to grant." Below them, in the meadow, their children's laughter rang out clear and joyful in the summer evening air, and above them, the first stars began to emerge over the mountain peaks that had once offered Warren Walker solitude and now offered them both something far richer. A home, a family, and a love that had turned a stranger's scandal into a town's cherished memory of kindness, courage, and the particular grace of a woman who had refused to let cruelty define her, in a valley that had, in the end, chosen instead to remember her exactly as she deserved. And so it was, in the mountains of Colorado, that Elsie Chandler, once a woman running from a scandal that was never truly her own doing, became Elsie Walker, wife of the valley's most beloved mountain man, mother to 3 children who would grow up knowing only love and acceptance in the town their parents had helped shape into something better than it had been, and living proof that even the harshest winter of the soul could, in time, give way to the warmest kind of spring, provided one had the courage to keep walking forward and the good fortune to find, waiting somewhere along that difficult road, a heart strong and steady enough to walk beside them for the rest of their days.